Welcome to The Buzz. I'm Christopher Conover. This week, how political campaigns spend their money. In April, The Buzz brought you an episode breaking down donations from Arizona to two top races in November's election, the presidential and the U.S. Senate race here. This week, we're diving into how those donations get spent. Arizona roadsides are starting to fill up with campaign signs, a sure sign that election season is now upon us. While the signs are a mainstay of running for office, many have questions if yard signs are used merely as a form of political engagement or if there's a possibility that they influence electoral outcomes. Among those who have wondered how much campaign signs do is Dr. Elizabeth Zechmeister, the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Zechmeister and her colleague conducted a study that gave insight into how effective signs can be, particularly in races that tend to see less media coverage or campaign spending. She spoke with Buzz producer Zach Ziegler.
We're getting to that time that, every other year we start seeing campaign signs popping up all over, be it people's yards or busy intersections. I know every time I drive past one of those, I sit there and think, what good does this do? You and a colleague did a study that offers some real insight to that question. If you could tell me a bit about it.
So we wanted to see if mere name recognition would influence people's choices over candidates. And we studied that in an experimental lab first, and we found some evidence that by exposing people to a name in a very subtle way, we could increase their tendency to say that they would support that person in a hypothetical election. We wanted to see if that effect that we found in the lab could be replicated in the real world. So what we did is we worked within the early stages of a local city council election, and we strategically placed yard signs with a fictitious candidate's name, a name that was not on the ballot, along a street that fed into an elementary school. And importantly for our purposes, the street was one of two primary channels by which those parents who were approaching the school to drop off their children would take. In experimental terms, the parents' assignment to one route or another was as if random, which means that we had both a treatment and a control condition. So after a few days of having parents on one route drive by our yard signs, and with the cooperation of the school's PTO, we sent a survey to the school's parents in which we asked them to not only indicate what route they took to school so that we could place them into that control or treatment group, but also to indicate their top three preferences for a set of at-large council seats that were on the ballot for that upcoming election. And what we found is that those who drove by the yard signs were significantly more likely to place that fictitious candidate's name in their top three choice set.
This sign was very vague from what I saw in the pictures. I mean, it just had the name, Ben Griffin, I believe it was, in blue and red block letters. Didn't say what office this person was supposedly running for. Do signs really need anything beyond that name to be effective after we see these results?
They may not. And we were motivated to conduct this research in part because in political campaigns, we see a good deal of effort spent on activities that seem intended merely to boost name recognition. So campaigns print and display flyers, they give out buttons, they give out yard signs, and typically the most salient information on those items, and sometimes the only information on those items, is the candidate's name. We also wanted to make sure that we did not violate any local election rules. So we didn't, part of our decision to include only the fictitious candidate's name and to not include information like vote for me, I'm running for this particular seat. Part of our motivation for that was to make sure that we weren't interfering with the election. We merely wanted to sort of tread alongside it in its early stages and dip into public opinion in order to test whether or not a yard sign could potentially have an effect on people's preferences in that race.
So, a term that was used to describe this level of election, I guess we can say, is you referred to it as a low information race. Do you think there's a level at which name recognition that campaign signs or similar media offer quit working, or is this something that can work all the way up to the race for the presidency?
Well, to start answering that question, I think I would just back up and say, a lot of races truly are low information races. We spend a lot of time on the races that are, a lot of media attention, a lot of our own personal time discussing races that are not low information races. But we all know when we go to the voting booth on election day that there are a lot of offices under contention that we have really not spent a lot of time gathering information on. So a lot of elections are low information elections. And our study was designed to look at the effects of name recognition when recognition is stripped of everything else that might come with name recognition in the real world, and stripped of additional information that might be relevant to one's decision making over that race. So in the research that we conducted, we find that additional information that is both explicit and relevant tends to significantly decrease the influence of mere name recognition. In a set of additional studies that we conducted in our lab, we tested this by subtly priming a candidate's name. And then instead of just stopping there and asking people about their preferences for that candidate or another in a hypothetical election, we included some additional information. We included information that was both explicit and relevant. And the information that we chose to include was that one of the two candidates is an incumbent. And when we included that information, it's explicit. They're told very directly that one of the candidates is an incumbent, and it's relevant. Incumbency status does matter. When we include that information, the mere name recognition effect is drowned out. It effectively goes away. So could we extrapolate from this study, our study, to high information races where candidates are very well known and think that name recognition or yard signs may matter? Our study can't speak to that beyond suggesting that it's likely name recognition does not play a significant role in those elections, or at least not nearly as significant of a role.
Is this effect, for lack of a better term, an indictment of anyone, maybe the voters for not further educating themselves, or even for the folks in my line of work, the media, who maybe pay a little too much attention to the big races and don't get down to those lower level ones that can really affect our lives?
As someone who cares about how our democracy functions, I think it would be worth the effort for everyone to put a little bit more attention on these so-called low information races. They're often races that place candidates into seats that are closer to us than large, high-profile elections than the candidates and the eventual office holders in those elections are, right? So city councils make decisions that affect our day-to-day lives. They allocate resources that may determine whether or not the pothole on my street gets filled or not. And that, arguably is quite relevant to the quality of my life. And yet we do tend as individuals and I think, not trying to indict the media here, but yes, the media does tend to put a lot of focus on these very salient, high information, high profile races. So perhaps it's a call to pay a bit more attention to these races, but I don't think it's an indictment of the average voter who may lean on mere name recognition to make a decision. And the reason I don't think it's an indictment is not only because that voter has a lot of other considerations that they're putting their time and their resources towards, and as they manage their day-to-day life. And so it's understandable that someone may not have time to research deeply every candidate for every local election or every low information election, but also because people who are leaning on name recognition may be making reasonable inferences about the quality of that candidate, right? In our study, the studies that we ran in the lab, we did try to probe into this a little bit, and we did not find evidence that people were making inferences about the candidate's traits or about their experience in office, but we did see that they made some inferences about the candidate's viability. So the candidate's name that had been primed to be more familiar to the treatment group, those individuals felt like that candidate was a more viable competitor for the office. Now, what does viability signal? It could be that it doesn't signal much, or that people's inferences about viability aren't rooted in all that deep of a consideration beyond this looks like a winner and I'd like to back a winner. But it could be that viability is based in a candidate's expertise as a candidate, and maybe those things are meaningful to our candidate choice. So it's possible that even when someone is leaning on mere name recognition, that they are making the best rational choice that they can in that information constrained situation.
Dr. Zechmeister, thanks for joining me today and chatting with me about this.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Professor Elizabeth Zechmeister speaking with Zach Ziegler. We're looking at how political campaigns spend their money this week. Joining me in the studio now for a dive into the spending of what might be the highest profile race in Arizona this year for the U.S. Senate is Zach Ziegler, who we heard from at the start of the show. Zach, you did that interview to start the show, which featured a study about yard signs and their effectiveness. So let's start with things like yard signs when it comes to spending.
A quick recap, these numbers, for the most part, unless we say differently, are the spending data for the first quarter of 2024 in this U.S. Senate race. So you'll hear mention of Kyrsten Sinema's name, though she did drop out on March 6th. And we're going to lump campaign signs in with mailers and other physical media because they're often ordered from the same place. You go to the same printer shop, you get your campaign signs, your mailers, other things along those lines. The effect of a primary is something that we can see a bit in this area because we're seeing Republican candidate Kari Lake spend the most on these kind of things, about $750,000 that's gone mostly to mailers and postage to send those, whereas Ruben Gallego, the Democratic nominee, has spent about $475,000, again, also mostly on postage and mailers. Mark Lamb, the other Republican candidate in the race, has spent notably less than either of those two, about $57,000, and we do know for a fact that $5,400 of that was spent on signs because he broke that down in his campaign finance filings, and we have some idea of what Kyrsten Sinema spent. She had a category that said fundraising, postage, and catering, which amounted to $2,200.
Which makes sense, being low, because, of course, she probably knew she wasn't going to be running, and she didn't have a primary as an independent.
Yeah, that's definitely something that probably held true in this, was when you don't have a primary, why start spending so early?
Exactly. Talking about things like mail, when we were looking at these numbers, there was one word that came up a lot, and that was the word list. For people who don't follow campaigns buy the lists with my name, your name, everybody's names and addresses on them. That's how we get all those great mailers in our mailboxes. Very important, and can also be very targeted, looking for specific demographics. So how did spending go on those lists?
Well, we saw Ruben Gallego purchase the list, spending about $61,000, whereas we saw listings for rentals of lists from Kari Lake and Mark Lamb. I don't know how one rents a list of names, but Kari Lake spent about $42,000, Mark Lamb $6,500, and we did see very specifically exactly what this was for from Kyrsten Sinema, the words donor profile list, on an expense of $1,000.
Now, another category that falls into this non-physical media is what it's called: online ads, TV, radio, and print ads, as opposed to those campaign signs and mailers. dollars already are flowing pretty heavily into those non-physical media areas.
Definitely so for Gallego. He has spent $1.5 million for what was dubbed a paid media buy, and another $1 million in digital. That's some notable expenses, though that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be seeing those ads or are currently seeing them already.
Exactly. What people need to understand is when it comes to buying those campaign ads that we know are going to take over our non-public media stations, because I know our listeners do actually watch non-public media stations, though we would prefer they watch public media. Those ads are purchased well in advance. And when it comes to campaigns, if you aren't buying those ads now for September and October, and it comes time that you may want them close to Election Day, they simply may not have the space available.
Definitely. As for Kari Lake, doing a little less of that, spent $45,000 on what her campaign dubbed placed media and $423,000 on digital. Mark Lamb, only about $10,000, and that didn't even seem to be related to a true media buy. It was for media production, so maybe that was something like putting together the ads themselves. And Kirsten Sinema, $185,000, though her campaign finance filings did mention that about $100,000 of that had the word retainer in it. So maybe that was just kind of reserving something and knowing that it might be able to come back, but who knows?
Or maybe locking up a consultant or somebody like that, that if she had decided to run or decides to use some PAC money to get involved in a race, she's got the people she needs.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk a bit about non-promotional items that campaigns spend on. You know, there's an old adage that it takes money to make money. That's true for campaigns, since they hold fundraising events among other types of events.
Yeah, the mentioning in these filings of words like event, catering, facilities was what we really looked at for some idea on this. We saw Ruben Gallego spend $39,000. Kari Lake spent $24,000, and notably, $22,000 of that went to Mar-a-Lago LLC. Mark Lamb spent $2,300. Kirsten Sinema, again, $7,200, but that's that same thing we heard about earlier where it mentioned postage and event in kind of a mixed category, so we're not exactly sure what that was.
Now, I'm sure there's a phrase in there that perked up a lot of our listeners' ears, Mar-a-Lago LLC. Of course, that was a big expense for Kari Lake, and Mar-a-Lago is former President Donald Trump's home and club in Florida. If Kari Lake is holding events there, I'm guessing she's not alone.
Definitely not. We found 21 political committees have paid Mar-a-Lago just in this election cycle, handing over more than $1.1 million for various things, but mostly talk of events and lodging, meals, things like that. The majority of that money came from two Trump-related committees, totaling more than $660,000. Kari Lake is the number 7 as far as campaign spending money at Mar-a-Lago. There were a handful of others that we saw in there. Bernie Moreno, who is an Ohio U.S. Senate candidate, Jim Marchant, a Nevada U.S. Senate challenger, and funds tied to some people in the U.S. House. Alabama Representative Dale Strong, Ohio Representative Max Miller, who was a Trump advisor, Florida Representative Gus Bilirakis, and Missouri Representative Mark Alford all outspent Kari Lake.
So Mar-a-Lago, not in Arizona, so candidates travel. Let's talk about that, be that travel for fundraisers in wealthier places or to campaign. How are these U.S. Senate campaigns in Arizona spending their travel dollar?
So we looked for words like travel, a pretty obvious one, flight, reservation, lodging, car, mileage, words that could indicate travel either near or far. And we saw Kyrsten Sinema actually has spent the most with $87,000. Now, an interesting little thing there was it said $65,000 of that was reimbursing security for travel. Ruben Gallego spent about $37,000 in these travel-related expenses. Carrie Lake, $34,000. And that does not include most of the expenses that went towards that Mar-a-Lago trip. Those were earmarked for things like catering and event rental spaces. Mark Lamb has spent $4,200.
And as this campaign goes on and we keep watching these numbers, one of the things that will be interesting to watch is Ruben Gallego's travel spending, because he gets that incumbency effect where his job as congressman from the Phoenix area, he goes and meets with, shall we say, produce importers down near Nogales, and it's called an official trip. That's for Congressman Gallego, but they're the same person as candidate Gallego. That's the incumbency effect. And that's not to pick on Ruben Gallego. All incumbents do that, and all incumbents have that advantage.
Yeah, and you could see the same thing happening for Mark Lamb, the Pinal County Sheriff.
That's exactly correct, possibly on a smaller scale. So security is another expense that many of these campaigns mention, and it sounds like it's a major expense for Senator Sinema. How about the others?
Yeah, so Kyrsten Sinema in total, on top of that $65,000 we mentioned for reimbursing security for travel, her total expenditure was $135,000 related to something mentioning security. To compare that, the next highest was Carrie Lake at $17,000, Ruben Gallego $1,600, and zero for Mark Lamb, not surprising for a law enforcement official.
Exactly. He kind of could be his own security, because often you're hiring law enforcement officials for that security. Mm-hmm. So legal and compliance spending. Lots of laws around campaigns and campaign finance and all the things that are related. That's a pretty common expense. And running a campaign's not easy, and the legal hurdles are numerous.
Yes, and the person who spent the most on that was Carrie Lake. Her campaign has spent $49,000 on it. We looked a little bit into who that went to, just because there has recently been news around her attorney in Arizona, Brian Blem. He was not the person who was doing any of this legal work. It was a company called Elections LLC out of Washington, D.C. That belongs to Stefan Passatino. Elections LLC has done work for campaigns for Donald Trump, Herschel Walker, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and others so far this election cycle. Now, also looking at this, we saw $42,000 from Mark Lamb, $23,000 from Kyrsten Sinema, and interestingly, $0 from Ruben Gallego, listed as going to legal or compliance spending.
Well, that actually kind of brings us to our next topic, staff and payroll. Gallego, because he's run a number of times before as a member of Congress, maybe he's not hiring outside legal consultants. He just has those people on staff.
That could be a possibility, as Ruben Gallego has spent hands down the most on things like payroll, health insurance, workers' compensation insurance, $354,000. The next closest to that was Kyrsten Sinema, who spent $27,000. And Carrie Lake and Mark Lamb had $0. But there was a notable difference in what they were calling consultants' fees. Those were notably higher. Carrie Lake spent $760,000 on consultants. Mark Lamb, $171,000. That compares to Ruben Gallego's $31,000 and Kyrsten Sinema's $122,000.
And again, that's consultants versus staff members that they're paying. So I guess we should give everybody a quick look behind the scenes. We'd hoped to do this show about a month ago, but other topics like the protests on the campuses of the 3 state universities proved a bit more pressing, so we put this one off. For this last topic, let's listen back to a bit of audio. It's Mike Noble from Noble Predictive Insights in Phoenix.
Let's say you and I were hypothetically going against each other in a political election. I'm out 10 points in the polls or whatever, right? But you look at the campaign finance, and I raised some money, but I got no cash available. Like, I got no gas in the tank when, especially in the last 30 days of the election, when folks are most paying attention. If I go dark in those last 30 days because I don't have the resources, I'm probably going to end up losing that race.
So let's talk a bit about how much candidates are saving and what those burn rates are for everyone.
Well, and these numbers are one where we'll go a little broader than just the most recent quarter that we have reporting for. This is for the entire election so far. Kari Lake has spent about $3.1 million. That's of the $5.7 that her campaign has reported collecting. Ruben Gallego, about $12.4 million of the $20.8 that his campaign has gathered. Mark Lamb has spent about $1.3 million of the $1.6 million gathered. And Kirsten Sinema had spent, before her campaign was terminated, about $7 million of $17 million in its bank account.
Well, those are the numbers, as we said, for the first quarter. Good news, Zach. You and I can stop staring at spreadsheets for a little while, at least until the end of the current quarter we're in. Thanks for all of your time on spreadsheets, and thanks for jumping on the other side of the glass for a few minutes.
Yeah, well, that's at least campaign finance spreadsheets. I always have at least 5 or 6 open.
All right. And that's the buzz for this week. Tune in next week as we get an update on Southern Arizona's economy. You can find all our episodes online at azpm.org and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for The Buzz Arizona. We're also on the NPR app. Zach Ziegler is our producer, with production help from Desiree Tucker. Our music is by Enter the Haggis. I'm Christopher Conover. Thanks for listening.
AZPM's original productions are made possible in part by the Community Service Grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by donations from listeners like you. Learn more at support.azpm.org.